Welcome to this week's episode of the Refold Roundtable Podcast, a podcast where we talk about all things language learning. And this week, we're talking about all things pitch and intonation and pronunciation. I am Gord. I am the community manager for Refold, and I like languages. And today we have Bree, Keji, and Vanessa. And Bree, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Bree. I also like languages, but I am only learning Spanish, and I am the social media person for Refold.
Social media mage.
Social media mage, social media apprentice, social media wizard, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, mage is good. I think that's my official job title.
And Vanessa.
Yeah, I'm Vanessa, also known as Shiki on the in the Refold network. I am a Japanese learner and I am a language coach for Refold.
And finally, we have our special guest for today, Keji.
Hey, I'm Keji or Kezi, longtime Japanese learner. I've been in Refold since its inception, and yeah, like learning mostly Japanese, but sometimes I learn other languages as well too, or try.
All right, and you are a longtime Japanese learner, right? It's been like what, 7 years?
Five, but it's been pretty on and off, and I'd say for most recently, there's not been that much learning going on, but I still enjoy the language though.
For sure. I think that happens when you get kind of like solidly good at the language. It sort of just becomes something you do rather than something you study.
Yeah.
And you are well known, Keji, in the community. And that's how we read it, right? We read it with a j, not a z.
Oh yeah, that's completely fine. Yeah.
Okay.
I go by either
Y-
or Kezi or Keji.
Okay. Because Keji's kind of like the English way, and I guess Keji's the Japanese way of pronouncing that romanization. Uh,
Yeah.
And you're well known in the Refold community and the language learning community at large for one of your projects. So you've got like Kotsu.io, which is like a website that has like pitch accent trainer, has some sort of like parser maybe, where like it'll
Yeah.
parse something and give you like pitch, like while you're reading, kind of like a visual, like if you put a paragraph in, you can look at the pitch of each word. You also have a bot for Discord that is quite popular. People ping it and then it gives you the pitch of a word. And you've got like a pitch accent trainer, and then you've even got some stuff from Mandarin. I think you've got like a tone trainer on Kotsu.io.
Yeah. The caveat that the tone trainer is definitely not perfect, has several bugs still, but yeah, I just like making tools for language learning and things that are helpful to people. So
And Kotsu.io is like all that stuff is like free and open source, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm excited to have you on, Geji, because actually we have been using, and Vanessa knows, we've been using Kotsu.io and as part of our coaching process for helping clients, people who come to us for help at Refold, learn tone distinctions. Um, and it's not a lot of work. We just tell them 10 minutes a day when you're doing your Anki, go and do 10 minutes of pitch accent training with your tool, and we've had a lot of success with it. It usually takes a month or two, but after a month or two of people just doing 5 or 10 minutes a day of pitch accent training on Kotsu.io, in addition to all their other stuff, their intensive listening, their immersion, they actually seem to improve.
Oh, it sounds great. Yeah, I'm glad it's helpful. Definitely didn't start out with the tests. It was more of a way to I was helping out a YouTuber, goes by the name of Udai, who many of you might know.
Yudai
But
Sensei, I'm familiar with him.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, I was
he's a
helping. Oh yeah,
he's a YouTuber, a Japanese YouTuber who's also is very proud of his English ability and his Mandarin Chinese ability, right?
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
and he does a lot of pitch accent focused videos, and he at the time I think I was creating a so we actually had a way to transcribe subtitles uh, using sort of like a collaboration like software, and that was what Kotsu.io was at the time, basically helping Udai write subtitles for his videos.
Okay, so the inspiration behind Kotsu.io was helping Yudai Sensei, who has a great YouTube channel, and he used to be active in the Refold community, subtitle his videos.
Yeah.
So what happened? What led to it being this sort of pitch accent master site?
I think it was probably at one point getting bored, having a ton of free time, and I think that was also it was already a year into COVID, but I think basically I got bored at some time and added a bunch of other tools to it, and one of those was the minimal pairs test, and from then I think we just added a bunch of things to supplement that, and then it became what it is today.
Yeah, and would you say that the pitch accent stuff, the tone trainer, the minimal pair trainer, uh, would you say that's like overshadowed the original purpose of the website?
Um, I think it complemented it. And I think because Culta.io, the idea behind it was just a hodgepodge of tools. And I think that tests, pitch accent tests, are one of those tools. I do think that, like, a lot of times, though, people tend to focus on just those tests and not the rest of the site. But there are a lot of, like, hidden eggs that you can find on Culta. For example, the Anki part of Kotu. It has its own built-in Anki system that's separate, completely separate from Anki, which stole the name. But it actually has a newer version of SuperMemo's algorithm in it, um, which so the current
So
version of
what
Anki uses
version?
like
What version? So Anki uses a modified SM2, which
yeah
is one of the
SM2.
oldest algorithms. Well, what's the Kotsu.io Anki clone or Anki? I guess you can't really trademark the name. That just means rote memorization in
Yeah.
Japanese, right?
They could probably, but it uses SM15.
Okay, and right now I think SM18 is the most recent version, so that's pretty up to date.
Yeah. And when I say SM15, it's what somebody thinks is SM15 since we don't have
Okay,
access
because
to that.
I was about to ask because uh, Wozniak, he keeps that sort of behind lock and key, and I was going to ask if you talked to him and got permission. So it's what someone has extrapolated to be SM15.
15. Yeah.
Gotcha. And yeah, I think Kotsu.io is a very useful tool. I personally, mostly, I'm guilty of focusing only on the pitch accent side of things, but apparently it has a nice flashcard system, SRS system, and yeah, that's an amazing tool. Do you want to give us a little bit of background info on like how you learning Japanese? You said 5 years. I thought it was 7 originally. So like, give us a quick recap.
Yeah, so it was actually it's closer to 6 years now, but I started in 2016, in the summer of 2016, and so basically it was just I wanted to learn a language, and I think I was stuck between Japanese and French. I'd already learned French in high school, so I decided to go with Japanese, and my initial language journey was using just looking up random stuff online, finding random sites. I think Rocket Languages was one thing that I like stuck to for a bit, which is basically like a podcast style lesson with tools to help you after. Um, and it was pretty much calm from there. I think I used WaniKani a little bit, and then in when I went to university, I actually decided to minor in Japanese initially. And so I went to some of their courses over the summer, and they had a couple accelerated courses, and I basically stuck with those, and for the most part. And I think one of the things that probably separates that experience from any other experience you might have at like a college Japanese university course is that our university used a book called JSL, which happens to be a
Yeah,
book
by
that's
Eleanor
focused.
Hartz Jordan. I mention it all
Yeah,
the time on the podcast, Keji, because it is one of the few textbooks that's one, it's old. It's from like the 80s or the 70s too. It
Yeah.
teaches pitch accent from the very start. Um,
Yeah.
so totally, the frequent listeners are aware. The new listeners, you have learned that Keji, the pitch accent guru himself, used JSL. And how was using JSL, by the way?
I liked the format. It might have just been a me thing, but I think the format definitely felt nice to me, especially the fact that they had audio too that I could just listen to and walk around and not pay like much attention to. I don't have to like actually read the book. I think one of the main points of the book is that you don't for the conversations you don't actually need to look at them. You just need to use the audio, and that's what the main focus is. So I think a lot of controversy uh, is thrown around about the book because it uses domaji in all of it essentially. Um, but the main point of the romaji is that you're supposed to get past it and just you're supposed to listen to the audio, which is why it's Japanese, the spoken language. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, JSL stands for Japanese, the spoken language, and it's an older style textbook. It's what we call in SLA circles audiolingual, aka the Army method, aka drill and
Yeah.
kill. So obviously, instructors use them in different ways, but those sort of textbooks were designed for you to like listen to the audio, memorize it 100%, and then go do audio drills. And is that how you went through the book?
Yeah. Yeah. So I was doing when I initially started it was summer courses, and these summer courses were about like 9 hours long of classes. Um, and so each class had you before the class you memorize the core conversation as it's called, um, which is usually encompasses a couple conversations between people, usually short utterances, and you go to class with that and you basically perform after you memorize those.
All right. Yeah. And 9 hours of class does not sound like a whole lot of time.
Lots of breaks in between, though. I think there were like, uh, there's an empty hour in between for,
Okay, so it's not 9 hours the whole like
wait,
course, like not
it's
nine
more like
class hours, like a
45,
9 hour class. So
no,
like you
it's
go
like
in and
45-minute classes, that are like
gotcha,
spread out over the day.
gotcha. Cool. Well, thank you for your background in Japanese. Um, and yeah, moving back to like pitch, I guess one of the questions that we had for you was like, when did you become like aware of pitch? And it sounds to me like if you started with JSL, Japanese as spoken language, you probably already knew about pitch very early on.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. JSL was what awoken me to. I may have heard of like the term used before, but JSL was the initial time that I had actually thought to invest time in it.
Yeah,
Especially
and
its mention of like pitch accent is it's a whole section of JSL. They dedicate the intro, a large part of the intro, to learning about pitch accent, and every tidbit they add about pitch accent really added to my curiosity for learning more about it.
they use kind of an idiosyncratic romanization, right? That does cover pitch.
Yeah, it's an off. So that I forget what ski it is. It's like Tokyo ski or something like that. So it's not Hepburn at all, but it's one that's more commonly used in Japan. Um, but it has a couple modifications to it. Um, the accent marks on top of it being one of those for labeling pitch.
So I actually have a question because I don't have any experience using any textbooks for Japanese aside from uh, Genki. We all know it. We all love it. Um, so in Genki, when it comes to pitch accent, it's pretty much just mentioned one time at the beginning, and then it's like never talked about again. So I'm wondering how that compares to JSL. Like, is it an ongoing theme in the textbook? Like every chapter they say, okay, this thing has this pitch accent, blah, blah, blah. Like, is that how it goes?
Yeah, for the most part. Every single word is labeled with pitch on it. So you cannot look at anything without seeing the pitch accent attached to it.
Okay, that's interesting. Um, I mean, I guess the obvious answer to the question would be yes, but that it's helpful. But I'm wondering, like, how how helpful it was because if you went through it and then by the time you finished the textbook, like how did you feel about pitch accent? Did you feel prepared, like you understood it? And like I'm wondering how that led into what you did from there after you finished the textbook.
Yeah. So actually, I was at the time very confused about pitch accent, specifically because the book didn't mention enough. It just mentioned enough to tell you what the pitch accent of a given audio that they had for the book was. But it didn't tell you the rules or any explanation of why things changed. It just gave you a basic overview, and then maybe some indication of what happens between different grammar points. Like if you end a verb in must, then it's like the accent's on the ma part. Um, but it didn't give much explanation beyond that, so it was kind of hard to pick up those extra details, which is why I became so invested in it. Uh,
So, did you use the textbook in isolation, or were you also listening to other native media or reading native media? Or I'm wondering how the immersion component was worked in or came to be in your learning.
yeah, so, and forgive me since it's like 4 years ago, or four
Right.
more years ago, but I did do immersion on the side as well as the book, but it wasn't very connected with reading from the book. It was more of just like passive immersion, if you will, YouTube videos, anime, things like that. Um, yeah, there wasn't much.
Okay.
I didn't actively try bridging anything from the textbook that much, other than just investing time in the textbook.
So when you were
Okay.
listening to your immersion material, you weren't like actively looking for pitch patterns or anything. You were just listening to it normally and doing most of your pitch training like via the textbook, or did you look for patterns while you were immersing?
I think that so I did occasionally, but it wasn't like a common thing, and I think that that especially comes out when so I actually did do some talking to some output as well too, and I think that was more of the case where I would try to use what I learned from the textbook. Um, at the time, I think I used a couple Discord servers like EJLX, and basically at that time that was when I was there's a I forget what the hypothesis is, the monitor hypothesis, where you basically monitor yourself and you basically try to fix your output mistakes. Um, so that's actually what I was doing a lot for when I output at the time.
Okay. So I'm wondering um, how that influenced your pitch perception or perception of the language in general and being able to monitor your own output and uh, give yourself your own feedback, or if you had a native or a tutor or something.
Yeah, so I think that it helped and it's mostly I think a mindset that when I was outputting, whenever I came across a word that I didn't know the pitch accent for, I would immediately like question myself and look up the pitch immediately. Over time, I realized that that was kind of a bad thing to do when it comes to fluidity and trying to like speak smoothly because I would, question myself and I would lower my confidence. But um, eventually it got to a point where I was able to flick it on and off. So if I wanted to pay more attention to my pitch while I spoke, then I would pay more attention. And if I just wanted to speak for the sake of it, then I just speak.
So if
So
you
how
were
did you how did you get into immersion learning then, Kechi? If you kind of came in with this sort of traditional background, but very unique, right? You found rocket languages, which is sort of like you mentioned, like a podcast type thing. Reminds me of Pimsleur, sort of, if Pimsleur were like a website. And then you did JSL in school. How did like you said you didn't really immerse much. So how did you become this sort of mainstay in the immersion learning community if for the first however long you were not an immersion learner?
I think it has to do with the focus on pronunciation and pitch accent. Um, so I was in the original MIA server, and there was a pitch accent channel there as well too. Um, and I think the point of the community might have been to focus on immersion, but I think another part of it was to focus on different methods and definitely sharing tips on pronunciation. Um, so I think that was one of the reasons that I stuck to the community a lot. Um, Not that I'm like against immersion or saying that I didn't use immersion at all, just that it played a smaller factor, I'd say, or it wasn't as gung ho. I wasn't as gung ho on on immersion. It was more of a laid back type feeling whenever I wanted to immerse type thing, and eventually ended up being something that I would do because consumption of media is enjoyable.
All right. So basically, you just like the community. You were, into the pitch accent, discussing methods, and then I think you're right. All roads do lead to immersion at the end of the day when you get to the point where you can kind of just have fun in the language. Um, but that's very interesting to me. Now, being this sort of unofficial pitch accent guy of the immersion learning community, um, what's your experience with non-standard pitch? So I'm assuming most of your data set gives the quote unquote official pitch. How much does that vary from like the reality of listening to spoken Japanese?
Mm. Definitely varies if you look at the youth population. Um, so there's like tendencies within the Japanese language. For example, one tendency is to pronounce everything flat, or heiban. And so you might see some words that are accented in the dictionary, but some people pronounce it flat, or words that have two different pronunciations to them, and the flat pronunciation takes on a different meaning, and it's more used among younger population. So and like just regional differences. There are some regions that are close to standard, but they have like there are notable things in their dialect that are a bit off, um, and sometimes those influence the standard dialect a bit. So eventually, there are um, those feedback into pitch accent dictionaries, but to what extent and to how fast that feedback into those dictionaries varies depending on the dictionary. If you look at a dictionary like Daijiseng, then it's very modern, I'd say, in terms of current Japanese. But if you look at a more traditional dictionary, then it might not reflect how people are pronouncing things nowadays. It would reflect the older population, or what announcers would deem is the more correct, traditionally speaking, variant of an accent.
That sounds similar to what's going on with like Mandarin Chinese, where officially a bisyllabic word will have two tones, but a lot of mainlanders tend to pronounce the second tone with no tone, aka neutral tone,
Mm,
aka fifth tone, which sounds to me a lot like the tendency for like words in Japanese to end up being flat or heiban.
yeah.
And just like Japanese, dictionaries and official standards are slow to update to reflect this. Um, but they are. They do occasionally update and reflect it. That's really cool. I had no clue that this sort of, I don't know, there's a word called like iotization because at one point Greek turned all of its vowels into iota, like an E sound, E. And it sounds to me like
Mm.
Japanese is kind of eating its pitch accent a little bit. Um, and things are changing. And it'll be interesting to see what happens because, as we know, Korean used to have pitch, and
Mm.
one or two dialects of modern Korean still have it. But Korean has basically eated its pitch accent, and also it used to have vowel harmony, where vowels would change depending on like in to match other vowels in a word. And it'll be interesting to see what future Japanese has, if it goes the way of Korean of getting rid of pitch, or if it collapses pitch and there are fewer variations. Because I've heard Matt talk about it. Pitch is not the same in dialects. Some dialects actually have more complex pitch accent patterns than the Tokyo standard. Um,
Yeah.
so I've heard that Kansai, it's easier to go from Kansai because they have tone like sort of pitch accent mergers where you can guess the Tokyo pitch, but unmerging those and going from say Tokyo to Kansai is a lot harder.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, and there's also the uh, pitch accentless regions as well.
Right.
So, I mean, it's definitely going to be interesting to see how that forms. I definitely think there's going to be a lot of simplification. Like if you have a pitch accent rule where something falls on the second last more or something like that, then the rule's generally going to be more faithful instead of the amount of exceptions that we see today.
So that makes me curious about something. Um, I'm curious on your thoughts on this kind of group of people who, um, I guess, have decided to disregard pitch accent. And I'm wondering how you feel about the difference between someone who has decided to just disregard pitch accent as a learner versus those pitch accentless dialects or regions, and how the pitches are evolving naturally with younger people who are making things Heibon. And it's like, I guess, how you feel about the differences and how that compares to people who just say, oh, pitch accent doesn't matter.
Mm. Yeah, so with those regions that have pitch accentless Japanese, it's not necessarily that they're able to pronounce things however they want to. There's still a way that they pronounce things. Um, so it's it's one system. Um, it's basically just that with pitch accent you have words are somewhat distinguished by their pitch accent. Um, but in those dialects, it's more like words aren't distinguished by their pitch accent, but we might say the whole sentence with a given intonation pattern. So it's not necessarily that you're able to say whatever you want to. Um, and I think that overall, though, pitch accent is just uh, another area of pronunciation that we look at. And UDI actually has a video on pitch accent, on why if pitch accent will matter for you. Uh, but it doesn't necessarily. I don't think it's like a requirement though to learn Japanese, but it is something that you can improve on for the sake of pronunciation, for the sake of sounding more, for the sake of being easier to pick up when a Japanese person's listening to you. Um, it's still possible, 100% possible for them to uh, understand what you're saying though without pitch accent, but it is helpful to an extent.
Yeah. So what would you say um, is the most efficient way to improve pitch accent perception? Like, because some people they always claim they can't hear it. Um, So, in your experience, how did you get to where you could hear pitch accents? I can imagine you can tell when something is standard, when something is standard-ish, And you can probably even tell something really deviant, like when somebody is from like a totally flip-flop pitch accent region and they say things really strange. I'm sure it sticks out to you today, but think back to 4, 5, 6 years ago. I'm sure it didn't stick out. Did you do anything special to like get to that point where you could pinpoint, okay, this speaker is from Kansai, or this speaker is from so on and so forth?
For that specifically, I don't think I did anything special in order to distinguish that, other than knowing standard dialect. Um, Eventually, I came across some YouTubers. I think most notably, Jari Jari Tawa. They're two Manzai comedians, and they're unmistakably from Kansai. So I think I just matched Kansai with whatever they say, and I eventually learned that that was like Kansai. Um, but I think that if you're learning pitch accent, then you will just see so many inconsistencies with the way that a person speaks when they speak with a in Kansai Ben, that it'll just like stick out to you, and that might not be initial something that you come across initially, especially since if you listen to somebody that's young, then they might mix Kansai with standard dialect. Um, so yeah, and even people who speak standard dialect, when they're originally Kansai Ben and they speak standard dialect, sometimes they pronounce words with the wrong pitch accent, and so that gives them away, kind of.
All right. So with pitch accent, you did a lot of study, like explicit study of pitch. Did you do any sort of other study for pronunciation? Did you learn the IPA, or was it just going into the JSL book and like kind of like taking it really seriously based on what they taught pronunciation as?
Yeah. So initially, I did do a lot of so the pronunciation at the front of JSL, it goes over the ways the way when it introduces consonants, it tries to compare them to English consonants and then tell the reader how it's different from English. So I looked a lot at that and tried to use that to help pronunciation. Eventually, I did run through IPA as a part of one of my linguistics courses that I was taking. And so I picked Japanese as my language and basically looked at the differences between English IPA and Japanese IPA. And I actually think that is really beneficial for any the beginners of any language when you're looking at studying a language, to like be able to compare the IPA symbols that your L1 language or your native language uses to the L2 language that you're studying, and being able to say, okay, my language uses this sound but the other language uses this sound, so it helps to basically point you in the right direction of what to look out for when you're pronouncing those words in your L2 language.
Right, because there are a couple of sounds that Japanese has that are very similar to English, but not quite the same. Like, they have like alveolar palatal sounds for like their ja and sha sound. They're not the same as ours.
Yeah.
Or I personally tend to hear velar nasal like for the syllabic in sound that they have, like at the
Mhm.
end of a word. Like sang to me sounds a lot like sang with an ng sound, but it's not. It's different. And do you have any specific books that you would recommend for people who do want to do a deep dive into pronunciation? Or it doesn't have to be books, sources. It could be Udai Sensei's channel. Do you have any recommendations for people who do want to do a pronunciation deep dive with Japanese?
Yeah, so I've heard Sounds of Japanese uh, has good ratings. I haven't used it personally, but I have looked at the initial pages and I was like, oh yeah, this is definitely a good book. And then another book that I know is called Nihongo no Hatsuon Kyoshitsu. Um, so Japanese pronunciation classroom. Um, and that basically it goes over pitch accent and pronunciation and also intonation as well too. So if you want to know you know, it goes over the minuscule details of intonation for a word, for example. If you pronounce things you could take the same sentence with the same ending intonation and vary the way that you adjust the pitch between pitch accent phrases, and that somehow emphasizes one pitch accent phrase over the other pitch accent phrase. So it teaches a lot of details like that and includes a CD as well too. That has audio that tries to demonstrate that as well too.
So when it comes to all of this, this Japanese classroom you mentioned, is it for JSL speakers, Japanese as a second language speakers, or is it for native Japanese people? I'm kind of curious if like, do people who speak a non-standard variety of Japanese, where do they go to learn the standard variety if they want to be like a broadcaster, right? If they want to have like their news reporter voice.
Oh, so the book 日本語の発音教室 or Japanese classroom, Japanese pronunciation classroom is I believe the initial page says it's advertised for uh, foreign learners, but also for people who are learning standard dialect and newscasters and people like that as well too. So I think it's a pretty broad array of people that they want to support. Um, but for people who are learning standard dialect, I think that they would tend to use like books like that or online resources. Um, I think that it's pretty common in Japan to at least have some idea of what standard dialect sounds like, given that it's on almost all media. Um, so it's more about practice than it is learning the rules. I think people who learn the rules would tend to be more those people in TV roles or something, or like professionals.
So one thing that we tend to see like cross-linguistically is that varieties that are close to the standard but not standard tend to be the last ones to die. And what I mean by that is, in northern Germany, there used to be like a whole other language spoken called, Low German. Um, but because it wasn't mutually intelligible with Standard High German, it just got replaced wholesale. And now it's basically a moribund variety. It's just not spoken. Um, you see it with like English. If somebody speaks a variety that's close enough to the standard but not, uh, they're less likely to change than if somebody is from the middle of nowhere, like Appalachia or Scotland, where people just don't understand them. Those people are more likely to have to like go out and learn, like essentially to be bi-dialectal. Are there varieties of Japanese that you would say would fit into that mold that are kind of standard but not?
I would say that there are a lot to the point of like there's no such thing as standard. I mean, there's standard dialect, but Tokyo dialect isn't standard dialect. It's like Tokyo dialect is what people say is like the closest thing to standard dialect, but not standard dialect. And the surrounding areas around Tokyo and expanding from Tokyo, all of those regions have a somewhat standard dialect, but it's not standard dialect. Um, and pitch accent is one of those reasons, and another reason is the word choice, the word usage as well too, um, is not like standard. And so, like in certain regions, you have like they have be, they add like be at the end of sentences, um, but that's not since that's not standard. That's but people still understand it though. So um, if anything, I think that it becomes a trope of that region, um, but not necessarily something that I see dying out soon. Uh, but I wouldn't trust my word on it since I'm not
And
focused
and
on that part of it.
right, and that's sort of just like the ones that are close enough to being standard. How about the more divergent varieties? Like people from like right before you get to Hokkaido, right, where you've got like Aomori Peninsula. Those people are notoriously difficult to understand. Um, would you imagine that those speakers of those varieties are more likely to try to adopt the standard?
I think that if people are in the region and they stay within the region and they so it just depends on their needs. If they need to use standard, then they have a need to use standard. But if they're within that region and um, there isn't necessarily a reason for them to know standard, then there wouldn't be a point in them learning standard. But I do think that it's one of those dialects that you won't see, taking over the internet or something. Um, but hopefully we can preserve it somehow, though. But yeah.
So, do you have any like future plans for Coaster.io to like support like looking up a word? So, like right now, I'm assuming the way it works is if you look up a word, it gives you just the standard pitch. But would it be a cool sort of like future expansion project to include the pitch and say the other big varieties that people go after, like kind of Kansai dialect?
Yeah, it definitely sounds like an interesting idea. And I've heard this idea before from, I know like a couple of Japanese people that are also kind of interested in this idea of like Japanese people being able to contribute to a dictionary and say that they're from X region and they say this word that way. Sort of like Forvo, but kind of a more documented way of labeling things. Um, and basically being able to measure how much of a certain how a certain region sways in terms of the variance of pitch accent that they use. As far as
So,
oh yeah,
oh, sorry, you can finish.
oh you good. As far as like other features though, I'd say there's not much other than minor improvements to the pitch accent engine. Kotu does parsing as well too, and improving parsings just I think would help a larger problem that there is when it comes to pitch accent. Of, for example, if you have like um, external decks that use pitch accent, they might not always pick the right pitch accent when you have a sentence that you want to label with pitch accent. So having a parser really helps to uh, figure out sentence pitch.
Yeah. So that kind of leads me into a question that I wanted to ask is how you feel about the current state of the Culta.io website and like the current tools that it has and if you have plans to expand on it or do anything else with it or go beyond just Japanese with it or possibly make it into a mobile app or something. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think that so personally, I'm not going to be doing that much like hands on, but I think that I know a lot of people that would like to add um, like work on mobile apps or work on adding more features to Kultu, and so there is interest in adding such features. Um, but personally, I'm not going to be doing that much. But
So
I like the way that
it's
like Colts is currently structured to expand like tests currently a lot easier. So uh, there could be another couple tests that pop up that make it easier uh, for learners to focus on certain topics of pitch accent.
So you're not the only one working on the site. Like, I was under the impression that it was just you who was maintaining and adding things to the site. So is it more collaborative with other people?
It's basically a 99% me.
Okay.
um, it's it's collaborative in the way that I want to push other people to work, other developers to work on it as well too.
Gotcha. Because I would love to be able to download a Kultu like mobile app and look up pronunciation on things quickly, like Forvo, and hear the pitch accent for things. Kind of like how we have the pitch accent bot in the Japanese server, but have it embedded in a mobile app.
Mm. Yeah, I'm also like open to having the API open so that other apps can use Colt's endpoints and sort of like rake information from there. Specifically when it comes to like the parser, because I part of me like envisions that like it would be a really neat idea if everyone sort of like contributed to a single parser and it got decent, really good to the point where you could just use that as the de facto, and it would be able to reliably give you the pitch accent of a sentence. Um, but yeah, I'm also looking forward to expanding the like availability of APIs for audio for words, or I think there's also an API to uh, get the text to speech audio for a sentence using Cultist parser. So
Yeah, I'm personally not the biggest fan of text to speech. The robot voices kind of get on my nerves, so it'd be great to have some native pronunciation of things. I mean, of course, if you generate pitch accent on the fly and have a robot voice read it out, not much you can really do about that. But it would actually be really cool. It'd be better than waiting for someone else to record and for you to hear them say it, like having something quickly. Um,
yeah, it's not the best option, but it's at least it serves a purpose, but probably not the purpose for most learners, I'd say.
mhm. um, I'm wondering, since you have this tool now, um, if it's something that, I mean, I guess the inspiration behind it was you made it because it's something you wish you had when you were learning Japanese. So I'm wondering, like, if that's true and how you would have used the tool personally in your own learning.
So the tools weren't necessarily something that I wish I had. More more just like something that I like thought was kind of interesting, so sort of expanded on. However, I did use something that was similar to the minimal pairs test. There was like a quiz on Memorize's site that I used that helped me distinguish pitch a little. Um, I used it a little bit, and I think that that might have served as an initial inspiration for minimal pairs, but I doubt I recalled that site when I was actually making Kultu. And there are some interesting ideas that I wanted to explore with Kultu. For example, there's a conversation section that basically it tries to implement what JSL does with conversations and memorization, and so I plan on adding a lot to that, and I think that would, if I wanted to allow others to sort of experience how I learned Japanese, then that would definitely be one feature that I would work more on.
Okay. Do you have plans for other projects or other tools separate from Koltu?
So currently I don't have ones that are separate from Kultu. However, there's one that is very so there's a feature that's kind of interesting about Kultu that can be expanded to a whole separate tool, I think. And that's there's a test for Kultu that works on production. Specifically basically taking an input and being able to say, okay, this word's pronounced Atamadaka versus Odaka, or um, something like that. Um, is something that I was working on, and uh, I think it could be expanded a lot more to dissect a sentence into its individual parts and label pitch accent. So something working on something like that would be pretty cool. But I think it wouldn't be something that I directly advertise towards learners. It'd be more of something that's like a lower level project.
So
Gotcha.
I have a question. A lot of people seem to like hyper focus on the pitch accent side of Coaster.io. If you were in their shoes, basically as the dev, how would you like to see people using Coaster.io? Right? It sounds to me like a lot of people don't utilize a lot of the features of it. Um, so what would you like to see people do with the site that they're not currently doing?
Um, hmm. Um, I think that on Kultza currently, there are features that don't necessarily advertise themselves as features. Like, for example, transcription is a method that I've looked at too before. Sort of like the idea is picturing what you think you're hearing is being said and being able to like write that down and see how accurate your transcription skills are. So there's the transcribe section of Kotu that allows you to input a YouTube video and sort of like make a transcription along with timestamps for that YouTube video, which doesn't advertise itself as like as it doesn't advertise itself as a feature that's trying to help you with transcription, but it mainly just serves as a tool. Um, and I think that's like the majority of Kultu is a bunch of tools that uh, you basically decide whether you want to use them for the purpose of learning. Um, Let me think. I
So
mean, there's
you
the Anki tools, the lists. You could make lists of words. Like I think that it's mainly just meant as a hodgepodge of different like tools that you could perhaps use for your language learning.
so what all tools does it have? It has pitch accent. It's got some sort of Anki clone. It's got a transcribe thing where you can transcribe things. And I've seen that before. Tagalog.com also has a free transcription tool where it'll play you a clip and then you type in the clip and you either get it wrong or you get it right. And it's quite popular. And I know that Cole, who has done some stuff with Refold before, he's the Kanto guy, he runs the Kanto server. He is a firm believer in transcribing things. He's transcribed multiple anime series in Cantonese, and he has a native check it to make sure that it's right. And he's a very big proponent of transcription. So I think that's really cool. And more people should be using it probably. They probably don't know about it when they think Kotsu.io. They probably think like I think it's the pitch accent site. It's the site you go for strictly pitch accent, but there's a lot of other cool stuff. So Anki clone, word lists, pitch accent, um,
The media
transcription. Is
section
there
useful
media
too.
section?
So the media section is basically like you can have like a YouTube player and you input a YouTube video and it like adds pitch accent to the subtitles below using Kota's built-in parser. Um, and it also lets you so like the Anki section, it ties into the Anki section, and there's a lot of different ways you could format your Anki cards to they're basically like these, I call them plugins, even though you can't currently like add any plugins, but essentially you can type in raw pitch accent into your card and have it appear with like better visuals than using backslashes or things like that. Um,
And by better
there's also
visuals,
a
you
way
mean
to
the way that you
the
actually
lines.
transcribe,
So like
right? Because
visually it adds like lines on top of things to show that it
okay,
rises or falls.
so I know that Vanessa is guilty of not liking the way that uh, sometimes pitch is transcribed in like an ASCII manner, where like um, it's like underscores and forward slash and backslash type of stuff. Um, and I think that can be a turnoff for some people who don't find it very intuitive. So I think adding lines is a great step.
Yeah. Also colors too, if you pick the like the pattern mode. So you could choose to have colors highlighted instead of lines drawn. So like blue for Heiban, red for Tamadaka. Um that's also an option. And
Yeah,
and that's
I'm
oh, yeah.
personally used to the arrow transcribing where it's like arrows that are drawn that go up and down, like in the pitch accent dictionary for Yomi-chan.
Mm.
Have you seen
Are
those
you talking
before?
about the directly like they go directly up and directly down those arrows?
Yeah, it's like a continuous arrow, I guess, that has like a little dot and then the arrow at the end. Like if it goes up, the arrow goes up and then it shows where the drop is, or if it goes up again or something like that.
I want to say I think I've seen them before.
Yeah, how do you feel about those? Like, how do you feel about the different ways to convey pitch accent?
Oh yeah, these ones. I think that like um so I think whatever method kind of works for you is like, like whatever floats your boat. Um I like the ones that sort of put both of them together, so like they any symbols that it uses, it sort of overlays that on top of the word instead of having them as two different things, so you don't have to like look between them. But
Oh,
also
gotcha.
I'm a fan of numbers too, though. Um,
Yeah, the numbers mean nothing to me.
yeah, it's helpful when you learn about patterns because then pitch accent becomes really easy. For example, like you might think of a verb pattern and it's the pitch accent always lands on the -3 mora. So knowing about -3 and being able to like recognize that number is like, yeah.
Mm. It sounds like I have to study pitch accent some more. I know that whenever George shares some Chinese words with me, and he like transcribes the tone with the number, and I'm looking at it, I'm like, I have no idea what this means.
Imagine being someone who's learning Spanish. Listening to all this. This whole thing is fascinating. I haven't talked very much about anything, but the stuff you'll have to do to train your ears to listen for pitches that you're not used to hearing in English is one, impressive, and two, something that I never really thought of before interacting with people learning Japanese because I'm learning Spanish. So it's been really interesting hearing everything. Keji, for you, what do you think was like your biggest challenge learning pitch? So we know about your methods, like how you learned it, but what was something that was the most challenging thing for you learning pitch, and how did you overcome that?
mm, Trying to remember a time where I was like really struggling with pitch.
A low key flexing over here.
No, I think most of the time that I was struggling with pitch, it was I translated that into like working on pitch more, which to me was like I guess for example like last names, first names, last names in Japanese, um those tend to follow a pattern. And so for me, struggling for pitch was basically trying to decipher what that pattern meant. And in some like um, in some meaning of the word that was struggling, but in other meanings of the word, I was enjoying it somewhat. Um, but when I was actually struggling with pitch, um, probably whenever I forget pitch or when I'm
Yeah.
like speaking
Like
is
currently
probably the
or
yeah.
in the
Is that
past?
is it a current
In the
problem?
past,
In the
it's
past.
not as much a current problem. It's a current problem when I haven't used the word in a long time, and I'm like, what's the pitch of that word?
Yeah.
But sometimes there are methods to get past uh not knowing the pitch accent of a word. For
Mandarin learners do
example,
this all the time. They just talk really fast and mumble. They hope that no
yeah,
one
that's one
listens and
way.
like no one notices.
I do that in
I
Spanish,
know
but for
s-
conjugations, don't at me.
I know some people have they like in Japanese you could add like gudai to a word. So if you have like a quantity or any type of amount or so like any of the uh joshishi or like counters, you could just add good eye to them, and you don't have to worry about the pitch accent of the counter because it's just because it good eye basically becomes the dominant accent and shifts the whole accent to the good part. So I know people who've said that they do that.
All right, so
I'm just over
hashtag
here
just add
taking
gudai.
notes.
Yeah, just add gudai.
Hey, that's a
Never.
great hack.
Yeah.
I've heard of German and Dutch learners using everything in the diminutive to not have to remember the gender because, unlike Spanish, the German and Dutch diminutive makes everything take the neuter. So you can avoid knowing the actual gender of a word. Again, not quite the same as a pitch accent hack, but it seems like every language has these little hacks to like kind of skirt knowing the actual way to do something.
Yeah, yeah. Well, guys, I think that sums up this episode. This was really fun for me to listen to. I got to learn an awful lot about pitch accent, which is something that I'm not super familiar with. So, Keji, thank you so much for joining us. I really enjoyed being a fly on the wall of this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, definitely. And that wraps up this episode of the Refold Roundtable podcast. If you're tuning in for the live premiere, please make sure to join us for the after party immediately after the podcast in the Refold Discord. If you love this episode and want to hear more, you can listen to past episodes on YouTube and Spotify. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to give us a like and leave a comment to let us know. If you'd like to suggest a comment for a future episode, we would love to hear from you. Please suggest future topics in the Refold Discord, and the links to our Discord and everything you need to find is in the description beneath this video. So thank you everyone for joining, and we will see you next week.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Refold Podcast. We hope you enjoyed listening and maybe even learned something new. Projects, events, and content like this podcast are only possible thanks to our generous patrons. If you liked this and want to see more similar projects, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Visit community.refold.la/Patreon-benefits to learn more.